Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
There's only one story in the news if you're in the United Kingdom this week, and it's the question of the future of the Labour leadership. At the time that we're recording this, scores of Labour MPs have called for Keir Starmer to resign in the fallout of the local elections and the devolved elections in Scotland and Wales. And we're in one of those situations where it's very difficult if you record a podcast that sometimes strays into contemporary events, because you know that almost whatever you say is almost going to immediately be out of date. So certainly at the point that we're recording this, the pressure on Keir Starmer appears to be becoming intolerable, at least for his long-term survival. And so to think about that, what we thought we'd do is talk about, certainly in my case, other examples of prime ministers coming to the end of their premiership, and in particular, what lessons can we take from the downfall of Theresa May, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss under the last government. And then, Richard, I think you're going to talk about the Labour Party rules for replacing a leader, which, by the time this comes out, you may know more than we do now, may soon be triggered. So to kick us off, the one thing I really wanted to reflect on was what I think is a really important distinction in leadership challenges and when pressure builds on incumbent leaders or prime ministers. And that's this distinction between when does somebody basically lose the authority to lead and the authority to govern, and when does political reality in terms of their actual status as leader or prime minister or the mechanisms for bringing them down catch up with it. And I think the three examples from the last Conservative government of prime ministers who were brought down mid-term demonstrate it quite well. So if we take the case of Theresa May, and we start there, of course, Theresa May gets elected in 2016. She wins an enormous share of the parliamentary vote in that leadership election. More MPs, as it happened, voted for Theresa May in the leadership election of 2016 than have ever voted for any Conservative candidate for the leadership who wasn't the sitting Prime Minister in a leadership challenge ever. So David Cameron in 2005, John Major in 1990, Margaret Thatcher in 1975, Ted Heath in 1965. None of them had as big a share of the vote as Theresa May had. But nevertheless, within a few short years, in part because of the challenges, of course, of delivering Brexit, but also because of the blunder of calling the 2017 election and then losing the Conservative majority, the pressure on her was building a great deal. The point at which I think we can say in Theresa May's case that she lost the authority to govern was in the build-up and around the confidence vote that was had in December 2018. Now, this is one of the ways in which the parties treat questions of having confidence in the leader differently. So, of course, in the Conservative Party, there was this process for if 15% of MPs sign a letter to the chairman of the 1922 committee, basically the trade union of backbench MPs, then there would be a vote of all Conservative MPs on whether or not the leader continued in post. There was a crescendo of pressure building on May in the lead up to December 2018 as her attempt to deliver Brexit was floundering. And then that vote was had. In that particular case, and it's quite noteworthy actually this, Theresa May did better in the confidence vote in December 2018 than either of the other two people who have suffered confidence votes as leader of the Conservative Party. She won a bigger share of support than Ian Duncan Smith in 2003 when he was leader of the opposition, and a bigger chunk of support than Boris Johnson in 2022. But nevertheless, 117 Conservative MPs, or 37% of the parliamentary party, voted against her. And that means one of two things happened. Either she lost a majority of backbench Conservative MPs, which I think is an intolerable position for a Prime Minister to find themselves in, or she managed to retain a majority of backbench MPs, but a significant number of people in her own government voted against her in order for the maths to work. And I think that was the point really at which Theresa May's fate was sealed. But what's quite striking in her case is that it's not until about 6 months later that she actually resigns after multiple failed attempts to deliver Brexit, which Parliament will not vote for. So you get this lag, I think, of about 6 months between when it's basically not possible for her to carry on effectively as Prime Minister, and when she actually signals that she will go. In Boris Johnson's case, the timeline gets crunched and is much shorter. So the downfall of Johnson is really a story of, well, it's a bit like the hokey cokey, really. Certainly, or maybe that metaphor doesn't work. It's a bit like a roller coaster in terms of the letters that are going in to try and trigger the confidence vote in him. It goes up a great deal over the Partygate scandal, which people will remember, and many people in the Conservative Party will have emblazoned and seared into their mind from 2021 into 2022. And then there's the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the pressure starts to ease, because rather like Keir Starmer is saying now, in the context of what's happening in Iran, people began to think this is not a time to change leader. And then in the following months, the pressure continues to grow until on the very weekend of Elizabeth II's Platinum Jubilee, there is a confidence vote held in Boris Johnson's leadership. And rather similarly, I think that is the point where we can say, or I would certainly be confident enough to say beyond reasonable doubt, that Boris Johnson's premiership is effectively over, because 41% of Conservative MPs vote against him in that confidence vote. And there is all this attempt by people who are loyal to Johnson to try and fudge it, basically, and say, oh, well, a greater percentage voted to keep him now than voted to keep him in the leadership election. Well, that's comparing apples and pears, really. They're incomparable events. An open leadership contest versus a confidence vote in a sitting Prime Minister are really not the same thing. And once again, it was clear that a majority of backbench Tories had either turned their back on Johnson or many members of his government had done. In that case, remarkably, within just a month, he was gone, when, rather like we've seen this week, a great many MPs started to call for him to go when people began to resign from the government. In Boris Johnson's case, to refer to these resignations, he wrote in his memoirs, "If Caesar had 23 stab wounds, I ended up with 62, in reference to the people who walked out from his government. And in fact, there was a time when Keir Starmer had quite a good line as well. Keir Starmer said in the House of Commons that those who were prepared to debase themselves by staying in Johnson's cabinet were, quote, the charge of the lightweight brigade, which is not a bad line. But interestingly, in the Johnson case, the gap between losing the authority to govern and actually going was only about a month. So it's really much closer. And in Truss's case, it was really a matter of days. I mean, it's so recent that I won't try and go over it all over again, the downfall of Truss. But during her 49 days of misrule, and certainly once you cut out the period of mourning for the late Queen, the period from the mini-budget, it becoming clear that it can't pass, the party conference, the crisis, and Graham Brady going into number 10. And basically when Liz Truss says to him, how bad do you think it is, Graham? Saying, I think it's very bad. Then she apparently said back to him, is it recoverable? And Brady said, I don't think it is. And she said, no, I don't think so either. And this really short conversation between a short-lived Prime Minister and the chairman of the 1922 Committee of Backbench Tories, a hugely experienced figure, of course, by then, Graham Brady. This wasn't his first rodeo, as they say, in removing a Prime Minister. Meant that the gap had shrunk basically to days or weeks in Truss's case. And I want to just throw that out there in terms of whatever happens in between us recording this and you listening to this, to Keir Starmer, it does seem to me that once you lose the authority to govern within your party, then basically very little is gained personally, and certainly nothing is gained for the country by dragging out that period between when your leadership is effectively over and when it is definitively over. And I certainly hope that Keir Starmer doesn't drag it out too long, because it will simply make it seem like he's been wrenched from number 10 rather than leaving with any remaining dignity. And if there's one nice thing I will say for Liz Truss, which I will say I'm not always that inclined to do, it's that at the point that she did resign, she had lots of other options to try and cause more chaos, to try and cling on maybe to the doorframe of number 10 as she was being dragged out. She could have tried to threaten Conservative MPs with a general election. She could have told the 1922 committee they need to change the rules to no confidence vote her. She did at least go easily. And that is one of the few things you can say to Liz Truss's credit about her discreditable period as Prime Minister. And I hope when all this is over, we can at least maybe say the same for Keir Starmer.
It's really interesting to go back and reflect on the quite different causes of the downfalls of those Conservative prime ministers. And there isn't, I think, a singular common thread that runs through all of them. But I think that the merits of those prime ministers resigning on their own terms differed quite wildly. I mean, I think when it came to Theresa May, it was clear that this was a prime minister who was unable to deliver the most important policy element of her government, which was to deliver withdrawal from the European Union. And because of the absurd Fixed Term Parliaments Act, what should have happened is the entire government should have fallen. But because Conservative MPs were too cowardly to bring their own government down, but they were happy to bring down the programme of their government by joining up with the opposition parties to defeat her Withdrawal Act. And that was both Brexiteers and Remain Tories, by the way. I'm not making a partisan pro or anti-Brexit point there. The only other solution in that scenario, I think, almost like as a constitutional matter, was to try to see if at least the Prime Minister herself could be changed. I think the situation with Johnson was very different. I think it was complete madness on the part of the Conservative Party to remove him. I was just looking, as you were speaking, Lee, at the YouGov polling that was done before Boris was brought down by his own cabinet, by Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak when they resigned together. The last YouGov poll before that happened had Labour on 36%, the Conservatives on 33%, and Reform on 3%. And that was interpreted by the Conservative MPs as catastrophic. I mean, it was absolute insanity, I think, to remove a prime minister who was, okay, he was behind in the polls, but like 3 points behind in the polls. The Tories were very comfortably around that 30% mark at that time. And that's not brilliant, but that's certainly not cataclysmic for a party to be in. And I think those ministers lost their heads over this scandal of Chris Pincher misbehaving and doing things he shouldn't have done. He shouldn't have been harassing younger men. I don't defend that at all. But is that the basis for removing a prime minister? Does it rise to that level? I don't think so. To be honest, I really think that Johnson could have weathered that storm if his ministers had remained loyal to him. And quite frankly, I think he could have defeated Keir Starmer at the next general election. I think Nigel Farage probably wouldn't have returned. Remember, the reason why Reform is at 3% in the polls is Nigel Farage is not leading Reform at this time. And the election of Liz Truss by the Tory membership is, I think, entirely an expression of outrage by the Conservative membership about the removal of Boris Johnson. Because I'll tell you who would have easily defeated Liz Truss in a Conservative leadership contest that summer, and that would have been Boris Johnson. Because if Johnson had been allowed to stand, and this is a really, really important difference between the Conservative rules and the Labour rules. Under the Conservative rules, a Conservative leader can never stand for re-election among the membership if they are challenged. That whole concept of being challenged doesn't really work in the Conservative rules. Once you've lost that vote of no confidence and you move to a leadership election among the membership, the previous leader is barred from standing as a candidate. Under Labour, the incumbent can stand before the membership. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn did that in 2016 when he was challenged by Owen Smith, and he handily won that leadership campaign, and it stabilised his leadership in a profound way. It became seen as such a stable leadership that previously a Corbyn skeptic MP called Keir Starmer happily joined the shadow cabinet as the shadow Brexit secretary under Jeremy Corbyn in 2016. So I think the conditions of Boris leaving were very different. Truss's conditions were different still. She was obviously deeply inept, not just in policy terms, but also in communication terms. There is also, I think, an important story to be had about markets and allowing markets to drive out prime ministers, which I think is something that we should be very, very skeptical of. And I don't welcome the idea of any prime minister, including a right-wing prime minister whose economic policies I disagree with profoundly, being seen to be driven out by speculators. Because I know that those kind of undemocratic elements, and I call them undemocratic because that's what they are, would be just as willing to do that for some of the left-wing economic policies that I suggest. And so I think you've got to be very careful how you, on the left, celebrate the Liz Truss removal, because it's not an uncomplicated picture there. But one thing I'll put to you, Lee, is how important do you think polling is on this? Because when I think back to times gone by when previous governments had really difficult periods, I think about the Attlee government in the winter of 1947, I think it was. And people were really suffering at that time. There was a period of intense austerity in consumer goods. And what I mean by that is the government, rather than cut public investment, restricted private consumption. That's another way that you can do these things. I think it's possibly in some cases can be a more socialist way of doing it. But people were not happy with the government over that. We've talked about when Harold Wilson had that disaster in 1968 in the local elections. And there was pressure on him to go. Now, by the time that Wilson was facing the local elections, there were polls that did exist, but they were infrequent. They were seen as somewhat unreliable. You know, to the extent we do have polling from that time, Labour was on about 20% in the polls, pretty bad. In the Attlee years, there were polls, but they were even more infrequent, even more unreliable. Today, we've got very consistent, readily available polls that come out. And now we have polls where pollsters model national polls on a constituency level basis. And I just wonder if you think, Lee, now that the frequency of polls and the detail of polls, the granularity of polls, makes MPs more skittish and more ready to lose their nerve. So reading responses to Truss, if you looked at Truss, if you didn't have the polls behind her, what I mean by that is if you didn't have polls showing the Tory vote drop under her premiership, do you think she would have been pushed out quite as quickly as she was? And do we need our politicians to be able to do something about that, in the sense of, should politicians be able to better communicate back to voters and to their own MPs this message about don't just focus on the polls, they're snapshots, not predictions? How do they get that message across? Can they get that message across?
Clearly, polling does matter because it's one of a number of pieces of feedback that MPs get about how popular the government is, their party is, their prime minister is, etc. MPs would not go into open revolt against a wildly popular prime minister. So certainly at a fundamental level, I think public perceptions of the leadership, and the most obvious and easy way that we see that, and we see it in numerical form several times a week, is with opinion polls. I think there's a very reasonable question to ask about, are MPs now too skittish about poor polling? With the caveat that I think people probably can distinguish between what would be, although the Boris Johnson case perhaps and the extent of polling influencing that maybe rather suggests that they can't. But you would hope that people can distinguish between what is midterm challenging polling and then what is catastrophic polling. That is basically irrecoverable for the party under that leadership. If you take the Truss example, within a couple of weeks, the Conservative Party's polling was in the teens. You had over 70% of people saying they thought the government was doing a bad job. It was so bad that it did not look like it was recoverable. Whereas with hindsight, the polling around the time that Johnson left was actually perfectly recoverable. It just wasn't as good as it had been in the last year or so beforehand. Polling is certainly, I think, a factor in Theresa May's downfall as well, and particularly how poor the party did in those European elections that you touched on in the previous matters of interest. There are a few things I wanted to come back on from what you said, but actually the key thing I wanted to mention is about this distinction between removing a leader and choosing their successor. Because I think how people judge what happened with the downfall of Boris Johnson really depends upon that distinction. Because at the time that Johnson went, the majority of Conservative MPs, I think in fact the great majority of Conservative MPs, thought it was time for a new leader. If they could look back on their judgment 6 months further on, when Sunak is Prime Minister but after the whole Truss debacle, then I am pretty certain that the vast majority of them would have wished that Johnson had stayed. Because even if Johnson became a very flawed or even a fatally flawed Prime Minister, that would have been better than what happened with the Truss saga. And this point about distinguishing really between defenestration and coronation, to sort of riff on the title of the book I'm bringing out on Tory leadership elections, I think is really important. Because if you think about leadership elections in the past, let's say when Harold Wilson challenged Hugh Gaitskell, Labour MPs had a choice between two people with two slightly different styles of politics about who led them. It wasn't just a question of, do you want to get rid of Hugh Gaitskell? Yes or no, and then who should replace him? It was a choice at the time. Same in 1975, when Margaret Thatcher challenged Edward Heath for the leadership. It wasn't just about ditching Heath, it was about replacing Heath with a particular person, and with a contrasting agenda. It's true in the vast majority of old leadership elections, when Michael Heseltine challenges Margaret Thatcher and John Redwood challenges John Major. MPs always had a choice. Now, in the Conservative Party, those two decisions are forced apart and not necessarily kept apart, because only the parliamentary party decides if a leader is to go through the confidence vote system that we discussed just before. And then there's this hybrid system that's partly MPs and partly party members that decide who replaces them. And like you said, the Conservative rules specify that a leader who has been removed by the parliamentary party cannot be a candidate to be their own successor. And that is in fact a good provision of the rules, in my view, because it means that what you can't have is a leader who the parliamentary party ditches, who is then reimposed on them by the grassroots members. I think it was a disaster when that happened in Labour in 2016 with Jeremy Corbyn. You do not fundamentally want that divide between the two. But the way in which parties now handle these things, but the key thing there, and it's something I think we should focus on in more detail in a separate episode because it's so complex and detailed thinking about it, is about the respective roles of members and of MPs, which becomes quite muddied and quite confused in the Conservative case at least, but actually I think more generally as well. So, Richard, what's your matter of interest this week?
Well, just totally coincidentally, my matter of interest this week is how to elect a Labour leader. As you said, Lee, at the start of this episode, there's so much focus at the moment on a challenge to Keir Starmer's leadership and the potentiality of a Labour leadership contest. But one of the things that has disappointed me, and I have to say I am disappointed, is the superficiality about which both journalists and, I'm afraid to say, MPs speak about the procedure for replacing a Labour leader. There has been so many inaccuracies in very confident posts and reports put out by journalists whose full-time job is to report on British politics in Westminster, but also by MPs themselves, including Catherine West, who, God love her, I really respect her for what she did, seems to be completely muddled about the rules for how to bring about a challenge of a Labour leader. I would have thought it would have been quite a good use of the time of MPs and journalists to open up the Labour Party rulebook, to go to page 28 of the 2026 Labour Party rulebook and read clause 2. When it's a clause is grammatically a sentence, but in a Labour rulebook, a clause goes on for 3 pages, which sets out the procedures for the election of the leader and deputy leader of the party. And just read it, okay? There are lots of things in the rules here that are unclear, ambiguous, open to interpretation. I accept that. They're quite poorly written. But that ambiguity should be a matter of discussion, should be a point of inquiry for journalists who write about the Labour Party. It should be a point of frustration for Labour MPs who are speaking about the Labour leadership contest. And what's really annoying me at the moment is people who are speaking with great confidence as if these ambiguities don't exist, that this is the procedure for doing it. So let me just pick up on two. One is one that we've already talked about in this podcast, and I won't belabor it, but I will talk about it because it's relevant here. And the other is something we haven't talked about before. So the first is the question of actually how do you begin the process of a Labour leadership contest? And the relevant part of the rules for this, when you have a challenger, is the following paragraph. Where there is no vacancy for leader, nominations may be sought by potential challengers. In this case, any nomination must be supported by 20% of the Commons members of the PLP, Parliamentary Labour Party. Nominations not attaining this threshold shall be null and void. Now, as we've talked about in this podcast in the past, it's not clear to me on the reading of that, just a text-based reading of that, how does an MP become a potential challenger? Is any MP a potential challenger? Or does an MP need to inform the National Executive Committee that I would like to be a challenger for the leader? And if it is the latter, then is the mere expression of saying, I would like to be seen as a potential challenger, does that then open up the window for that potential challenger to start collecting formal nominations? And under the Labour procedures, a nomination is actually a physical form that an MP has to fill out and sign and submit in Parliament, usually in a committee room in Parliament, to a committee that's formed around a leadership election. And MPs can submit nominations for themselves, they can submit nominations for other MPs, they can submit nominations for MPs who haven't declared, but that window has to be opened. And the rules are basically silent on how that window should be opened. And there are different ways of interpreting that. And one way of interpreting that, and I know that this is your way of interpreting it, Lee, is that a potential challenger has to pre-collect a list of MP nominations that aren't actually MP nominations, but intentions to nominate, then has to go to the NEC and say, here is a list. I don't know how they verify the list. Here is a list of MPs who have pre-committed that they will fill out those forms and nominate me. Please open the nomination window. I happen to think that's not the most straightforward reading of the rules. That may be the way the NEC rules on it, but it's ambiguous. And journalists are pretending like that is written out. That is what the rule books say. And it's just not clear. And it's also not consistent, in my view, with past precedent on this in the 2016 leadership contest. Angela Eagle did not release, to the public at least, a list of MPs who had pre-nominated her before she asked the NEC to open that window so that MPs could go and submit their nominations for the leadership. She claimed that she had enough backers, but she, as far as I know, didn't have some kind of officiated list. And it does also raise the question, what if an MP just made up a list? Is the NEC going to go through that list and ring up every MP who's on that list and say, did you definitely agree to pre-nominate this MP? So it's very flawed, but I don't hear any journalist talking about it. One journalist who I know listens to this podcast, and I feel bad singling him out because I know he's a respected journalist, but I saw today Lewis Goodall said that 81 MPs, i.e. 20% of MPs, is required to trigger a leadership contest. Well, what does it mean to trigger a leadership contest? It's not clear at what stage. So that's my first gripe. My second one is something that's not been discussed, I think, at all, but will become relevant if we do move on to the next stage of the process. Because here's another really weird ambiguity in the Labour rulebook. Under the Labour rulebook, it says that when there is a vacancy for leader, but the party is in opposition, you don't just need 20% of MPs, but you also need 5% of constituency Labour parties and 3 organisations that are affiliated to the Labour Party, 2 of which must be trades unions, which together must comprise 5% of the total membership of all of those affiliated organisations that are affiliated to the Labour Party. And those affiliates include everything from the Cooperative Party to the Labour Party Irish Society to Black and ethnic minority Labour to LGBT Labour. When it comes to a challenge, the rules are not clear. I think they are genuinely unclear as to whether a leader needs CLP and union nominations as well as the MP nominations. I think the most straightforward reading of the rules is that when there's a challenge, they don't. But I have been speaking to people who are reasonably close. I'm not going to say like totally up at the coalface, but are a bit closer to me to some of the potential leadership candidates. And they're talking about getting the nominations of different unions and affiliated organizations and CLPs. And I'm sat here thinking, I'm not sure you need them. Now, at the end of the day, and I'm sure you'll say this to me, Lee, the National Executive Committee is outside of conference, the ruling body of the Labour Party. It is tasked with executing the sovereign will of conference, and it is therefore required to interpret the rules that conference has approved, and that's how you change the rules, is through conference, as they see the best interpretation of those rules. And if you have a political membership of the National Executive Committee, which we do, then maybe they can read into some of these ambiguities, rules that I don't think actually are required, but claim that they are. And maybe that's what will happen. But what I'd really like is for journalists and MPs to make more of this and to raise these questions. And if they're not going to raise the questions, then please don't pretend like these things are cut and dry when you report on them, because they're not. Rant over.
Well, a few small points and then some bigger ones. I should say it's not my view exactly that somebody has to turn up with the names of people willing to nominate them in order to open it. My general view, which we've discussed in more detail on a previous episode, is that a wannabe leadership candidate will need to persuade the NEC that it is worth opening nominations. I don't think if just Joe Bloggs MP stands up and says, I want to challenge, they're going to say, well, Committee Room 14 for the next 4 days is going to be staffed convening nominations. I think they would want to see that there's a credible challenge. And there are multiple ways to make a challenge credible. One of them is that it could be in a situation like now. One of them is that the person making the challenge could be a cabinet minister. And another one is that whoever says they want to make the challenge turns up with a list of names and says, these people have told me they want to back me. So it feeds into this sense of how does somebody make themselves credible in the eyes of the NEC, who ultimately will adjudicate on these things. Second point I wanted to make is that I actually agree with the way Lewis Goodall phrased what he said, in that it is strictly true that if you have an incumbent Labour leader who does not wish to resign, then it takes 81 MPs to force a contest. Now, those 81 MPs can't just be doing as they're doing at the moment and tweeting out that they think it's time for a new leader. They do have to be doing something specific. They have to be nominating an alternative leadership candidate. But I think it is correct to say that in circumstances like now, and at the time of recording, the Prime Minister does not seem to want to head to the door. 81 MPs is what is required for a leadership election to take place. The slightly bigger points that I wanted to make, one of them is to agree with you about what is clearly a sense of confusion around this process, actually, and builds on that point. If you have a Labour MP who wishes to see the leader go, and there is somebody in the Catherine West position of the past week, who has said that they ought to go, that they're willing to put themselves forward and be a stalking horse, to use that great old hunting term that made its way into politics, to be somebody who is a vehicle and a catalyst for challenging the leader and changing the leader. Then the way in which you have to do it, basically, in my view, what I would have recommended that Catherine West does this week is basically say, I'm going to be sat in committee room, whatever, all week. I've got a piece of paper to nominate me. If you agree, not that I should be leader, but with the principle of changing leader, then come and sign this piece of paper. When I've got 81 names, a leadership election is unavoidable. The NEC will not be able to deny it, and there'll be enough people to formally trigger the process. And when there are 81 names, big hitters who actually want to be leader will have no choice but to get involved in the contest. Because if Catherine West has got a form with 81 names, then the contest is happening. Now, as it happens, she doesn't want to be leader. So at that stage, if you're Wes Streeting or maybe Angela Rayner or maybe Ed Miliband, you have to get in. And that is an example of why I agree with your fundamental point that knowing how these rules work in practice is really key. Because to riff slightly on the point I made in my part of this episode, tweeting out that you no longer think the Prime Minister should carry on in office, that's a way in which you can contribute to withdrawing the authority to govern from the Prime Minister. It is not a way in which you can actually bring about the reckoning with reality that he can no longer continue and force him from office. And I think understanding the rules is how you bridge that gap more effectively. In terms of what happens next, I suspect leadership candidates will want to get nominated by affiliates anyway in order to boost their credibility in the contest. But whether or not they need them, of course, is a different case. One thing I think is going to be really unfortunate is how long this is going to take. And it's a theme, in fact, I do write about in this book, which I'm sure we'll be returning to. Once you involve the grassroots or the party membership, or in the Labour case, the affiliates as well, in the contest, you can no longer do as you once did and have this all settled within a week. This is going to be a weeks and weeks or months long process to choose the new leader. And so what that ends up meaning is that, assuming that there is at some point fairly soon a timeline for Keir Starmer to go. At the time we're recording, that's not confirmed, but it seems increasingly likely. There will then be an interregnum in which we have a lame duck Prime Minister who won't be wanting to do very much, won't feel like he's got the political authority to do all that much, whilst leadership candidates are parading around the country trying to win the support of a relatively small selectorate of party members and affiliates. And there are many questions I think parties should ask themselves about it. Some of them is about whether or not that is a good idea in principle, but the one that springs to mind most now is that a reasonable thing to put the country through? Is it reasonable to basically tell the people of this country that your government is on hold for a couple of months whilst fee-paying members of the Labour Party and some trade unions decide who the next Prime Minister is? When the Conservative Party was faced with doing that twice in the same year, in 2022, after the resignation of Boris Johnson, the election of Liz Truss, which took quite a long time. I mean, Boris Johnson resigned in the June, she became Prime Minister early September. When they were faced with doing that a second time in the same year, when Liz Truss resigned, it became really clear to a critical mass of people that it was an appalling indulgence for the party to do that and intolerable to put the country through it. And I don't think that's only ever the case. If you do it twice in a year, I think there's an argument to say that it is never acceptable when a party is in government to administer its own leadership elections in that way.
Yeah, just on the time point, I think this question of whether the CLP, Constituency Labour Party, and affiliated society nominations are required could play a big role in the question of time. Because if the National Executive Committee says that the rules say, as I think the rules say, that those are not required when it comes to a challenge, and I think that's just actually an oversight in the drafting of the rules, by the way. I don't think there's any rhyme or reason for that. I just think these rules were tidied up quite badly. I don't know who Labour brought in to tidy up the rules, but they did a terrible job in my view. Sorry if you're listening, but stand by it. Then you could have a process that is at least a bit quicker, because if you do say that they need to get the nominations of the constituency Labour parties. The rulebook says that those meetings have to be all member meetings. And I think that although the rules don't say they have to be in person, I think there could be procedural objections if they are online only meetings. Usually, at least except in COVID times, the practice of the party is that an all-member meeting should be either in person or hybrid. So you've got to then think you've got 630 odd, take out Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland counts as one constituency for the Labour Party. Then you've got to have over 600 individual meetings organised by parties that in many cases are not in good condition. The membership is very demoralised, the membership is shrunken, people have left, parties are short of volunteers and activists, and they've got to somehow cobble together a room booking somewhere, and they've got to do this over 600 times across the country to have these nominating meetings. So just the mere fact of that pushes this process much longer. Whereas if the NEC says that these nominations are not required according to the rules, then you could jump straight to the ballot of members more quickly. I should say, and you've already noted this, Lee, that when we say a ballot of members, it's not just members of the Labour Party. It's also people who pay a political levy to a union that is affiliated to the Labour Party. And I have friends I know who are not Labour supporters, actually are very anti-Labour at the moment, but are members of unions like Unite and Unison, and they pay their levy to their union, who got a vote last year in the deputy leadership contest, even though in the local elections, these particular friends, I don't think I'll be able to be betraying their identities by saying this, in one case voted Reform, in the other case voted, I think, Liberal Democrat. So this is all to the point, which we've both made in this episode, that it's really important for journalists, MPs, advisors, plotters to read the rulebook, to get a sense of what is in the rulebook, what's not in the rulebook, what's ambiguous in the rulebook, and to speak about those procedures accordingly and to plan your political strategy accordingly, because it is often in the details like those where there can be really quite profound political consequences.
Well, by the time you listen to this, like I say, you will know more about what's going on right now than we do at the time of recording it. But hopefully that's been a bit of a useful way to think about leadership downfalls of the past, if this indeed does prove to be a leadership downfall for Keir Starmer, and how Labour will choose its next leader. We'll be back on Sunday when we'll be looking at the industrial strife of the early 1970s and the impact on Ted Heath as Prime Minister. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.